Kaieteur Radio, keeping you informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, senior journalist at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and tonight we have with us a very distinguished guest, British High Commissioner to Guyana and Her Majesty's non-resident ambassador to the Republic of Suriname, Ms. Jane Miller. Ms. Miller, thank you very much for taking the time to be on our program, and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so without further ado, Ambassador Miller, I'll jump straight into our questions this evening. Come July 2022, you would have served in your position for 1 full year. What is your assessment of where Guyana finds herself as an oil-producing state with noteworthy climate credentials?
Yeah, it's a really good question because Guyana is an oil-producing state. We all know that. 11 billion barrels have now been found. And it also has strong climate credentials. I've had the privilege of traveling around this country, and the forest is just stunning. It's the same size as the UK, as England, and has one of the lowest deforestation rates in the world. On top of that, the biodiversity and the way the country has really values its forests, the way it's sustainably forested, and it's been doing that for years. And for many years, Guyana has been a huge global champion for forests. So it does have very strong climate credentials, and it is also an oil-producing state.
Thank you. Now, on that note, how would you recommend that Guyana continues on this same pathway, but still strengthening that advocacy role?
I mean, it's all about how those oil resources are spent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about making sure those resources are invested in a long-term sustainable way. So it's about investing those resources in infrastructure, in clean energy. And that's what Guyana really has. You read the low carbon development strategy. I'm sure many of you have read that.
Yes.
The vision is very much as those resources, that black oil is turned into green development. So it's turned into new industries. It's turned into renewable energy. It's turned into roads and bridges and schools and hospitals. So that's why I see the magic is where the oil is actually converted into something that is really good for Guyana's future in a sustainable and a green way. So it's all about how those resources are invested.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, Guyana and the UK no doubt have a very strong trade relationship. But what role do you see the UK playing in strengthening ties with Guyana, given our vast resources?
Well, Guyana is a growing country, and there are huge opportunities for markets all over the world to be investing here. And so we have a lot of British businesses that are very interested in coming to Guyana, whether it's be working on infrastructure or education or health. And we see the UK provides a very high quality product. We know the Guyanese and the British have a really good relationship. So I see massive opportunities. Earlier this year, we had a trade mission, and we had a number of people coming here that really didn't know anything about Guyana and came here a bit sort of like, that'll be interesting. And they left glowing. I think it's the warmth of the people is one thing, but the amazing opportunities. This country is growing and growing very fast. You know, everything from the food and drink sector to the infrastructure. And I do see opportunities for UK businesses here where there's a win-win for both UK and Guyana, where you end up with an industry that produces jobs, that produces growth for this beautiful country.
Now, apart from the commercial interests, the UK many states in Europe, they do have a lot of knowledge that can be passed on to Guyana when it comes to what to do and what not to do when it comes to oil, being a model state. Do you think there's going to be opportunities for knowledge sharing in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the way that the oil resources are already being managed, I think they're learnt from other countries. I think many of you have heard about the oil curse or Dutch disease.
Yes.
So getting oil doesn't make you rich forever. And there's been some really horrible examples around the world where people thought, yay, we're rich. And they got that oil and suddenly things went horribly wrong. And there's some lessons that have been learnt. And one of them is, how do you use those resources? And the big trick is to use those resources into long-term sustainable assets, things like roads and bridges and hospitals and schools, into long-term energy projects, particularly around renewable energy. So it's about investing that money. So I don't know whether you want me to talk through Dutch disease, but very, very simply, it's where a country gets a massive influx of money very quickly, and it's usually from an asset, it's often from oil. It's coined by a term that in Netherlands, I think in the 1970s, so exactly this happened. Massive amount of money came into the country very quickly. That money went into the local economy. Everybody said, yay, we've got lots of money. What happened is that the local currency increased in value. People's wages went up, and suddenly all the local businesses that were previously exporting couldn't export because their products weren't marketable anymore. They weren't competitive. They were too expensive. And many local businesses just collapsed. They stopped. And the problem with oil is it's not an asset that's there forever. The oil disappears one day, and what's left behind? Nothing. All the local businesses are being lost. And that's basically what the Dutch disease is. So what you need to do is that money must be spent on long-term productive assets. It needs to go into things that actually supports local businesses, that enables local businesses to be there way beyond oil is ever wanted or there for any longer. So it's about converting that oil into those assets. So if you look at what the budget in Guyana at the moment, the money is going to things like roads and power and into schools. Another major asset of this country is the people, and putting money into education is another long-term asset. That is something also that survives well beyond the oil. So yeah, the world has learnt, and I think Guyana is learning those lessons. So I think the Natural Resources Fund, putting the money into that and using those monies to go into those infrastructure and other important assets, I think is really important. So yeah, I think that's probably the one big lesson. Probably the other big lesson is in terms of transparency. And I'm really pleased that Guyana is now a member of EITI. EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Index or Initiative. And it's an initiative that brings together the three major players on extractive industries. That's the private sector, it's government, and it's civil society. And to me, it's like a three-legged stool. If any one of those three don't work, the stool falls over. So it's really important to have private sector, really important embedded in it. It's really important to have government commitment, and it's really important to have a strong civil society that holds the whole thing together. So yeah, so it's those two things. It's about how the money is spent and making sure it goes into the long-term assets of the country. And then secondly, it's about transparency. And Guyana is now a member of EITI, and that's bodes well.
Thank you for that contribution, dear Ambassador. And I just want to pivot off of part of your response where you noted that Guyana seems to be demonstrating that she's already learning from the mistakes of other countries, especially as regards investments that are already planned for infrastructure and education and health. But you have worked in Africa, specifically in Tanzania and Nigeria, for example, for more than 2 decades. What key lessons, and this is a two-part question, what key lessons do you think territories like Guyana, that's new to oil and gas, ought to take away from countries like Africa, especially those you've worked in? What lessons we can take from them to make ourselves a success story? And secondly, how do you see us already setting ourselves apart?
Okay, really good questions. Well, I think the lessons I've already learned is that in terms of the transparency and how to invest the money. But the other thing is diversifying the economy.
Okay.
If you have an economy that becomes dependent on one particular sector, you are doomed because life is fickle and assets don't survive forever. So what I'm seeing in Guyana is investing in agriculture, and you've seen the enormous energy that the president has put behind the agricultural sector. I think is great. Ecotourism, another one. We've heard about call centers. So it's about diversifying the economy. So not become dependent on that natural asset, whether it be oil or whether it might be whatever. So for example, I was in Zambia for many years, and one of the big assets there was copper. And they learned eventually to diversify, but that's the key thing, is diversifying the economy, making sure that once the world's thirst for oil is gone, or once the world no longer needs oil, there's something there behind. And so, as I say, investing on those things is going to be absolutely important. Sorry, the second part of your question was what?
The lessons that we ought to pay attention to, especially for new producers like Guyana.
Yeah, no, I'd say the big lesson is about diversification. That's the key thing, making sure that those are available, those industries are vibrant and working well into the future. And things like, for example, roads, are absolutely critical. If you're going to have a strong agricultural sector, people need to be able to get their things to market. So that's going to be really important. Or whether you're wanting to increase the size of your market. So, for example, the road from Georgetown all the way to Lethem to Brazil increases the size of your market. So then when you're producing or when you're manufacturing, you have an ability to get your things to a bigger market than just the Guyanese market. So I think diversification is really important. I think thinking about what are the critical blockers that currently businesses have? What are the things that they find difficult? And we know that transportation is a big thing here in Ghana. More bridges, more roads are needed desperately. Also, the cost of electricity, that's really expensive in Guyana at the moment. And I think, the investments that are going in at the moment to reduce the price of electricity and particularly focusing on clean energy. And as you know, there's a number of solar projects that are away. There's the hydro project that's being planned, et cetera, making sure that that's really green energy.
All right. Thank you very much for that contribution as well, Ambassador. Now that leads me to the second aspect of my discussion this evening, and that's primarily on the environment. Now, there's an ongoing global discussion that there shouldn't be any more new fossil fuel projects, and that's necessary, some stakeholders say, so that we can keep global temperatures at 1.5 degrees. What is your take on this line of thinking and where it leaves nations like Guyana that are on the cusp of developing and even finding more resources?
A really important question. I think that the UK is currently the COP26 president. That's the United Nations Conference of Parties. So we're the president this year. And we've been globally a massive champion for keeping below the 1.5 degree because it's going to be catastrophic to many countries, including Guyana, if we don't stick to that. So the UK has a number of policies that we've put in place, and one of those is the fossil fuel policies, which means that I, as an ambassador, don't work directly with the oil sector at all. So if you're a British business coming here working in the oil sector, the UK government won't lobby on your behalf. So we have a very clear fossil fuel policy. However, for Guyana, I think we've got to step back and think globally. Okay, so we should be thinking globally. I want to reduce the globe's dependence on fossil fuels and move more and more to renewable energy and be cleaner in the way that we look after our environment. So what's absolutely critical is that we think about this globally, and we to reduce the global thirst for oil and gas, invest in renewable energy, increase our, when we have our homes and make them more efficient. And the same with businesses, making them more efficient so we need less fuel, making shipping more efficient, making airplanes more efficient. So we reduce the global amount for oil, but there will be a transition time. There will be a time where we are transitioning towards those cleaner and cleaner fuels, towards completely renewable energy. So the globe will still need oil for some years. And that's where Guyana is at the moment. There is still a global market for oil. My vision is that in the future, there will not be that same market for oil. And that's where Guyana will have its agriculture, its ecotourism, it will have its industries, it will have its technology, it will have its call centers, and it'll be fine. But for the time being, this is a great asset for the country, for it to be able to invest in that clean, green development for the country. So I think we've got to step back globally and say this is an opportunity for Guyana for its clean, green development. Globally, I do want there to be a reduction in the desire and the need for oil and gas and all those fossil fuels.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller. Now, on the environmental aspect as well, we know that oil and gas, it is a polluting resource. What advice would you offer us as we develop this in terms of the mechanisms that you'd like to see us put in place so that we can be a model state?
Well, I want to see Guyana convert its oil and gas into those assets in the country, and particularly around renewable energy. So I'm really excited to be seeing Guyana spending those oil and gas resources on those renewable energy. And I think that's going to be really important as the country goes forward. So yeah, it's about converting. And that's going to show the world that places can become greener. What's really interesting is a city in the UK in Scotland called Aberdeen. And it was the city where lots of the North Sea gas or the oil and gas came on board. Now, if you go to that city, it's been a real beacon for renewable energy. So there are examples around the world, even cities that grew up and became industrialized through oil and gas, they're now investing those resources in renewable energy. So you go to go to Aberdeen, and it's not an oil city, it's a renewable city now. And so it's about, I think Guyana can show the world how it can diversify its economy. It can show how it can use those oil assets to really develop in a green, clean way. And it's such a beautiful country with all its forests. It'd be so sad to see those destroyed. And at the moment, I see an enormous commitment by the government to make sure those stay protected as well. And that's really important. That's part of the lungs of the earth.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, earlier in our discussion, you referenced the Low Carbon Development Strategy, which is basically Guyana's blueprint to transitioning to a very green economy. What's your take on that document, and how do you think that positions us for the model state story that we're talking about?
I think it's great. I have reviewed it. I've sent lots of comments in. So I had all sorts of ideas of how it could be strengthened. You know me, I've got some ideas on gender, how that could be put into it more, for example. But I think it's a really clear vision. I think it's a really clear strategy of how the country wants to use its assets going into the future, including carbon assets. So I think it's really exciting. For me, the more exciting thing is going to be the next step when we see the implementation plan, where we see how all the strategies in there are prioritized and sequenced over time. But I think it's a really important asset, and I do encourage everybody to read it. I think they're still in the consultation phases. They've been asking for input from everybody. Yes. So I hope everybody's had their say. We will see the final iteration, I hope, very soon. But I think it's a really, really clear vision for the country's future. And it's very clear the country's future is clean and green.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller. Now, as regards the transition period that we're talking about, there's so many mechanisms that many countries are trying to implement to really reduce that dependence. And one of that has to do with a tax on carbon. Where do you stand on that?
Well, intuitively, it sounds like a good idea because it will reduce people's desire for it because it costs more. But before I'd make any recommendation on that, I want to do some really, really good modelling because there's all sorts of unintended consequences that can happen with taxes. So it would make your transport to work more expensive. It would make probably foods more expensive because they have to be transported. So I want to see any modelling done before I'd make a recommendation on that. What it would reduce is frivolous use of vehicles, for example. If your cost of your petrol was more expensive, the fuel was more expensive, you'd fill up less. but that assumes that you've got lots of frivolous use. And I'm not sure, I want to do some modelling first before I do a real recommendation in terms of putting a tax on fossil fuels and how much it would be and what the implications would be.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, we just celebrated or observed World Environment Day. What key principle would you say relatively new producers like Guyana ought to bear in mind, and not just from the intrinsic value of it, but the pragmatism of it? What should we always bear in mind? Because we have a resource that's really tempting for us to go in the other direction.
Well, I think the theme for this year was it One Planet? And I think, stepping back globally is the really important thing. And that is that we need to reduce the global thirst for oil. So as Guyana, a big thing is that oil is not going to be there forever. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's about diversifying the economy and making sure that there's going to be industries in the future. Oil is not going to be around forever. We know that renewable energy is so much cheaper and so much more effective. That's going to be the clean transition. That's going to be what is going to be the magic to energy security across the world. So, for countries like Guyana that are oil-producing states, the message is that oil is not going to be wanted forever. So diversify. Make sure you really invest in your people, invest in your long-term productive assets, invest in your roads, your schools, your hospitals, because that oil is not going to be there forever.
Ambassador, as you noted there from the global context, two quick issues on that. We have the war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen the significant impact these two unpredictable circumstances have had, not just on the oil industry, but just globally, just on the lives, everyday lives of citizens. Now, what would you say these two incidents say about energy security and the need, as you said earlier, for diversification?
Yeah, I think it's given a real lesson to the world on the need now to be really focusing more on renewables. We know that they're the fastest and cheapest road towards energy security. And I think it's been a lesson to the world. I mean, two shocks, one after the other, has been pretty catastrophic on the world. Yes. I think you've probably seen the World Bank statements just the last few days about the global recession. It's a really serious place that we're in. And I think it's a real impetus globally to be focusing more on those renewable energy. I think it's been a lesson to us all.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, you're not only our ambassador, but you're also a representative for the Republic of Suriname. On that, I'd love to get your take on the opportunities that exist between those the two Caricom states, on deepening integration and cooperation in oil and gas and renewables. Where would you like to see them go?
Well, I think they need to be learning from one another. I mean, Suriname has had oil for some years. Yes. Most of it was offshore, and now they have some offshore opportunities. I think the more we learn from one another, the stronger we are. And I think using Caricom as a means to really be thinking about how can we sustainably build those industries, but in a way that's in a clean way, learning lessons from the rest of the world. So I think collaboration is going to be really important. Both countries are small populations. Suriname is just 500,000 people, just 750,000 here. So I think learning from one another. The capacity is, the number of people in these industries is small. And the more they can collaborate, the stronger they'll be. So I think that collaboration that we're already seeing, I think, is very important.
Thank you for that contribution, dear Ambassador. And to close, there's another key question that I'd like to pose to you. We've seen a lot of reports about the doubling of the GDP for Guyana, but as we've seen with many examples around the world, a sizable GDP does not necessarily mean improvement in human development. How do we ensure that the two are matching as we go forward? What mechanisms should we have in place from your perspective?
Well, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's about how those resources are invested. If they're invested in a few elite people and the money doesn't flow across the country, you've got a problem. So it's about making sure you've got clear investment plans that really strengthen local industries. It's about putting money into health. It's about putting money into education. But it's also money into social services, it's into roads, into bridges, and all those things that we were talking about earlier. But it's about making sure you really put money into things that strengthen local industry. It's not about just putting money, cash into people's pockets. That might be nice for this week and next week. That is not sustainable. That causes huge problems into the future. It's really about thinking about those long-term productive assets and really putting the money into health and education. And I know the government is doing that. We're talking to them at the moment about building a new big maternal and child hospital here in Georgetown. You know, there's many examples, but putting money into those sectors is going to be important.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miller. I'll now ask you for your concluding thoughts on whether you believe Guyana is in the right direction for a sustainable future with her oil and gas resources and advocacy on climate change.
Oh, there's two different questions there. In terms of advocacy, Guyana's always been right at the forefront of the global stage, particularly on the issues of climate change and particularly on terms of forests. Guyana is one of the SMID-SIDS, the small island developing states, and they are vulnerable. They're very vulnerable. Guyana's seen flooding in recent years, and you've also got a huge seawall. If seawalls rise, you know, it's going to be at our peril. So I think climate change is really important to Guyana. Guyana's been a great advocate on the global stage. President Ali was in Glasgow last year, and he made a very strong statement, both for Guyana, but also for these smaller states across the world that are so vulnerable to climate change. So Guyana's being a really strong advocate. In terms of my closing message, I mean, this is an incredibly beautiful country. You are the lungs of the earth. You know, you've got this incredible forest. I think it's amazing that the deforestation rates are so low. The key thing for Guyana will be how it's going to invest those oil resources. And what's important is making sure that everybody keeps an eye on what's going on. You as the media, civil society, private sector, government, that all of us watch to see how those resources are allocated and make sure that they really do go to those long-term assets that are going to make this beautiful country even stronger and bigger into the future.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller. It was certainly a pleasure to have you on Guyana's Oil and You. Your perspectives were truly enlightening, and we do hope that we can have you as another featured guest in the future to share your perspectives on the developments taking place here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you again, Ambassador Miller. Do have a wonderful evening, and thank you to our listeners and viewers for being part of the Guyana's Oil and You discussion. Have a good evening.
Good evening.